The following is a conversation with Charles Kupchan. Kupchan is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and professor of international affairs at Georgetown University in the Walsh School of Foreign Service and Department of Government. From 2014 to 2017, Kupchan served as special assistant to the president and senior director for European affairs on the staff of the National Security Council in the Barack Obama administration. He was also Director for European Affairs on the National Security Council during the first Bill Clinton administration. Before joining the Clinton National Security Council, he worked in the United States Department of State on the policy planning staff. Previously, he was Assistant Professor of Politics at Princeton University. Kupchan is also the author of Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World, 2020, No One's World, The West, The Rising Rest, and The Coming Global Turn, 2012, How Enemies Become Friends, The Sources of Stable Peace, 2010, and several others. If you enjoy the content, enjoy the conversation, I please ask you to rate and subscribe to the show and follow the page on Instagram at Overcoming Divide as well as Twitter. Thank you. Welcome to the show, Charles. Pleasure to have you.
Good to be with you, Daniel.
With Ukraine and Russia at war, and that war ever, escalating in regards to NATO and the United States giving supplies in regards to military aid and economic aid, and now China dipping around the answer that they might supply arms to Russia. What do you believe, or where do you believe this war is heading?
I think that the second year of the war will prove to be more complicated than the first year. The first year has gone extremely well for Ukraine. The Ukrainians turned back the initial Russian effort to topple the government in Kyiv and have proceeded to take back about half of the territory, slightly less than half the territory that Russia took since invading in February of 2022. And the country has demonstrated remarkable fortitude and stamina and resolve in the face of an onslaught by a superior, numerically superior Russia. And you got to take your hats off to the Ukrainians for putting up such an amazing fight. And I also give credit to the Biden administration, their leadership of the NATO coalition, which really has risen to the occasion and is providing the economic and military assistance to Ukraine needed for the Ukrainians to survive the onslaught from Russia. So far, so good. A very impressive year one. As we head into year two, I see a couple of sources of uncertainty. Number one, the battle does seem to be turning into more of a stalemate. We do expect there to be offensives as the weather warms, the Russians pushing in the north in the Donbas area, the Ukrainians probably launching an offensive in the south to try to break into the land bridge that connects Donbas to Crimea. I'm expecting good days and bad days for both Russia and Ukraine. I don't think either country will be able to achieve what we would call military victory. And as a consequence, the war kind of settles into a war of attrition, to a slog. And then in terms of the supporting coalition, things are getting more complicated. Here in the United States, the Republicans have taken over the House. They have voiced a certain hesitancy to continue supporting Ukraine at the same levels. Public opinion on both sides of the Atlantic has begun to soften. And so I do think that as we head through 2023, and assuming a military stalemate does emerge, we may see an effort by the U.S. and its allies to broker a ceasefire and a potential diplomatic endgame. We are not there now. We won't be there anytime soon, but that would be my guess as to where we may be trending by the last quarter of 2023.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you a question because you say we're not there yet, but I am curious as we're not there yet, but you used terms such as stalemate, complicated, good days and bad days for both sides, pretty much coming down towards of what you also said, a war of attrition. And if we look at the Korean War, for one example, from July of 1951, I believe, the lines remained relatively stable, not too much fluctuation on either side. However, the carnage and casualties still continue to amount. Why should the United States not push now for peace, diplomatic peace, since we are backstopping their military efforts and their economy, and we would have some influence over when Ukraine does come to the table for a diplomatic solution?
It's an excellent question, and I share the impulse for the question in as much as this is a tragic war that is killing hundreds of thousands of people on both sides and polarizing the international system, imposing very significant costs globally, high inflation, food shortages, energy shortages, civil unrest, starvation in certain parts of Africa because of food shortages. So everything else being equal, this is a war that we would like to have end by the time you and I finish this conversation. That having been said, I do think that you need the parties to the war to be willing to find a diplomatic end game and to move from the battlefield to the negotiating table. And my sense is that neither Ukraine nor Russia is prepared to move in that direction at this point. Both parties believe that they will be able to make more progress on the battlefield. And I don't think it is in the interests of the United States to force Ukraine to take a position or to cease fighting before it is ready to do so, especially if the Russians are planning to continue their fight. And so, in some ways, even though we would like the war to end as soon as possible, we need to see evolution of the situation on the ground so that the parties themselves begin to contemplate the need to end the war. That's where I think, where and when the United States and its allies can play a role in shepherding Russia and Ukraine toward a ceasefire and an endgame.
Understood. From that, and the word you used was willing to, which I thought was a key word. When you hear Zelensky talk about wanting to take back, in essence, all of Ukrainian territory that was lost at one point or another, and then NATO and Biden specifically saying they'll back them as long as it takes, that doesn't really seem to be any kind of shepherding effort. Do you believe that, like, towards a peace talk, that is, do you believe that should be more of a strategic priority, or at least tactical maybe, of the United States moving forward with Zelensky and their wartime efforts? I was reading I was reading an article that you wrote in the Responsible Statecraft that mentioned that these wartime battles and these initiatives should be married to ultimate goal of diplomatic solution. But and you also mentioned this in the article, but that doesn't seem to be the case for either, at least a clear case for either Biden and definitely not Zelensky. And obviously, as you mentioned, Russia as well. So how does the United States take a bigger role in saying, we're here to support Ukraine? We obviously have been supporting Ukraine, but at one point we need to guide this to an end.
Yeah, I mean, as you're as your question suggests, I'm uncomfortable with strategic rhetoric that I believe is too distant from strategic reality.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I understand why President Zelensky, who's been a fearless, amazing leader, says that Ukraine will take back every inch of territory that the Russians have occupied, including Crimea and Donbass. And I understand why Biden says we'll support Ukraine for as long as it takes. But there are risks of self-entrapment. It may
Mm-hmm.
be that Zelensky at some point in the not too distant future will want to declare a ceasefire short of full territorial integrity. It may be that the Biden administration needs to settle for an outcome short of a Ukrainian victory. And they may then find themselves hemmed in politically by the things that they have been saying. So I do believe that it is time for a more sober and realistic strategic assessment and strategic dialogue. Again, not one that pushes Ukraine to do something that it's not ready to do, but a more forthright discussion, particularly in public, but also behind closed doors, although I don't know what's being said behind closed doors, but a more forthright discussion about what are realistic war aims, as well as what are the risks entailed in pushing for a full Ukrainian victory. I believe that if the Ukrainians break through to the land bridge and then try to retake Crimea through military force, the risks of escalation are quite considerable. I think that if Mr. Putin were faced with total defeat and the loss of Crimea, he would consider reckless options, including the use of a nuclear weapon. That, in my mind, is not out of the question. We then have to ask, is Ukraine's repossession of Crimea worth running that risk? I would love to see Ukraine retake Crimea and Donbass and go back to the borders of 1991 or 2014 before the Russian invasion. But I think that it's probably not going to happen in the midst of war. If it's going to happen, it will be down the road through a territorial settlement and probably await the arrival of a post-Putin Russia.
Do you think enough people understand the gravitas of the situation regarding retaking Crimea? I think you were speaking of kind of getting in a whirlwind of rhetoric, and with Zelensky and Biden, just people supporting Ukraine, willing, and how they're performing very well compared to all original expectations, but now may have lost themselves in this kind of mentality of that doesn't exist in reality in the situation, and considering the other side, which is Russia and their nuclear arsenal. And I don't know if enough people have really realized that Russia, not too long after the war commenced, changed their nuclear doctrine to when nukes could be utilized according to the government. And when we hear things such as retaking every inch and this unrelenting support of Ukraine, which Americans agree with, but do you think most Americans really understand the stakes of retaking every inch? Do you think that's really discussed at all? Like the tactical nuke is something that you mentioned, but I don't hear mentioned too often, or at least put out there too often. And we don't, I don't think, realize how close we are to that being used in the grand scheme of things, relatively speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the public debate is insufficiently appreciative of how dangerous the war is. This is as close as we've been to a direct war between NATO and Russia. Yes, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. There have been, the standoffs in Berlin. There was the Korean War, the Vietnam War. But this is a major land war in the heart of Europe, and a NATO-backed Ukraine is in a full-on high-intensity war with Russia. And so we're really one step removed from a war between the West and Russia. And that war could come about either by accident, because a Russian missile hits NATO territory. It could come about by design, because Russia decides to start hitting weapons convoys that are coming in from NATO. It could lead to a Russian use of a nuclear weapon if, in fact, the Russians were to believe that they needed to escalate to avoid defeat. Now, so far, all the parties have been pretty careful to avoid World War III. Biden has not put U.S. troops on the ground. He has not given Ukraine long-range missiles that could hit Moscow. He is not giving them F-16s. The Russians have avoided direct attacks on NATO personnel or NATO depots, knowing full well that that would likely lead to direct war with NATO. And Russia's having a hard enough time just fighting Ukraine. The last thing they probably want right now is a wider war with the rest of Western Europe and the United States. But I think that at times the rhetoric indicates higher stakes and perhaps overstates how deep in the United States should get. The war is often portrayed as the front line of freedom. If Ukraine is not able to fully defeat Russia, it will be the end of the liberal Western rules-based system. I think we have to be careful about such claims. Would it be a setback if Russia ends this war with a slice of Ukraine's territory? Of course it would be. Would it be the end of the liberal rules-based system? Would it be a fatal setback for liberal democracy? No. So in addition to having a sober discussion about war aims, I think we need a more sober discussion about stakes and about the extent of American and Western interests in the outcome of the war in eastern Ukraine.
You speak to Biden's prudence and his decision-making with not trying to escalate the war, but there are forces in D.C., close to where we both are, who want the war to be escalated in certain regards, who are pushing for, say, supplying F-16s, who originally were calling for a no-fly zone, but on both sides of the aisle. Now, that may have changed and that you're seeing more of a partisan divide with supporting Ukraine, but that still doesn't speak to the influences that Biden may have around him. And my concern, I think the concern of a lot of people may be that you speak to the things that Biden hasn't give, but one of the things that originally the Biden administration said they weren't going to supply were tanks. And they now and that was like a non-negotiable, but after a certain period of time, they have now supplied tanks. So are you also concerned with the possibility with this war dragging on, becoming more of a war attrition, the Ukraine needing more aid as they're using record amounts of military equipment daily, that they will get that request fulfilled eventually with time and with lobbying, both not just of them, but with DC lobbyists and organizational lobbyists to supply the F-16 request, which could dramatically escalate the war since fighter jets are pretty capable of flying into long miles, we'll just put it.
You're right that I think Biden, European leaders have so far gotten more criticism for doing too little than they have for doing too much. And you do have voices out there who are saying, give Ukraine what they need to win and do it tonight. Faster resupply, more weapons, F-16s, long-range missiles, no-fly zone. And I think that Biden has been right to draw certain red lines and to tread carefully. You're right to note that the red line has shifted over time, and that tanks used to be part of the no-go zone, and now we are transferring tanks. And that's a decision that is subjective in nature, based upon the assessment of the military experts of what Ukraine needs to defend itself, and that is not highly likely to lead to escalation. And I'm comfortable with the tanks. I think that they're an important part of armored maneuver warfare in Donbass, in the southeastern part of the country, and I think the Ukrainians will put them to good use. Do I think that there'll be pressure to go to the next step for the F-16s? Yes. Do I think that we'll see it anytime soon? Probably not. Partly because they're very sophisticated, they take a lot of training, and they would be a significant step forward on the escalatory ladder. The other point I'd make here, Daniel, is that I think the debate here is starting to shift. And that even though the more hawkish voices have dominated so far, you are beginning to get more people speaking up and saying, hey, what's going on here? And that's partly coming from Republicans who are none too happy, at least some of the Republican in Congress, about the scope of American assistance and the cost of American assistance. I thought it was very interesting that Ron DeSantis, a leading candidate for the Republican nomination, came out not too recently and put himself more in line with Trump than with the hawkish wing of the Republican Party, saying, hey, let's be careful here about Ukraine, and do we really have an interest in what happens in the borderlands of Crimea? So I think the debate here in the United States is getting more complicated. It's also getting more complicated in Europe. Ukraine fatigue, if you will, has begun to set in, and that is going to I think affect policy moving forward. Exactly how, we don't know, but I do think that Biden will have difficulty with this new Congress in securing the level of assistance that he was able to secure during year one.
Interesting. Looking a little different now, a little different outlook on this war. Do you see France taking more of a leadership in this war and how it unfolds? France has tried previously to distance themselves from European dependence to create dependence on the United States. Do you believe France will play more of a major role moving forward in the diplomatic, say, solution process with Russia and Ukraine?
No, I don't. In some ways, I think that the French call for what Macron, the president, he dubs strategic autonomy, that Europe needs to become more autonomous and independent from the United States. The war has in many respects drowned out that call. And that's because Europe remains dependent upon the United States. The United States remains a European power, deeply tied strategically to Europe. And I think even among French leaders and French voters, the war makes clear that the US and Europe need to stay closely tethered to each other. And I think that the war really has brought the two sides of the Atlantic together. And we've seen very few cracks. The US, the French, the British, the Germans, the Poles, really shoulder to shoulder. Sure, there are disagreements here and there, but the unity to me has been quite striking. The steadiness has been very impressive. So no, I don't think we're going to see the French step out in front. The
Hmm.
U.S. is still calling the shots more than the French or the Germans. In fact, you'll recall, Daniel, that the holdup on the transfer of German tanks
Yeah.
to Ukraine was that the Germans wanted the US to go first. They
Hmm.
wanted US cover. Schultz was sort of saying, please, Mr. Biden, you make this decision and then I'll
Yeah.
follow. So I think the picture is going to be the kind of US in the lead, organizing unity with NATO allies, working issues with the Ukrainians. And ultimately, if there's going to be some kind of settlement, discussion, negotiation, truce, armistice with Russia, it will require direct US involvement. Because in the end of the day, the Russians want to sit down as face to face with the United States. They see the US as the leader of the gang that's out to get Russia. And so I think moving forward, the United States will be front and center.
Understood. I have two last pretty interesting questions. Ones that remain off the mainstream kind of discourse. One of them dates back to April of last year, 2022, and it involves the peace negotiations or would-be peace negotiations at the time to call for an armistice between Russia and Ukraine that was being brokered by the previous Prime Minister of Israel. His name is eluding my mind, but those were stopped, halted, and that is look directly because as previous Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson flew to Ukraine, telling Zelensky at the time, we cannot have this war end at this moment, in essence. What what what's the reason for that? What do you speculate as being a possible motivation for that? And why that did not negotiations bear more fruit? Why would Boris Johnson go over there and say that?
I don't know exactly what transpired and who said what to whom on what day, but those negotiations, which took place to the best of my recollection in both Turkey and Belarus, were substantive, were constructive.
Mm-hmm.
There were critical issues on the table, including the possibility of a Ukrainian declaration of neutrality. But my best guess is that they didn't bear fruit and end the war, not because Boris Johnson said, don't stop the war now, or because somebody else called Zelensky and said, don't stop the war now, but because the parties themselves didn't feel that they were getting to a point in which the two perspectives overlap. And as a consequence, they both kept fighting. And what looked like a constructive conversation that might have led to an early end to the war uh, fell by the wayside as the momentum of battle picked up. So I'm a little bit skeptical of reporting that would suggest that somehow Russia and Ukraine were about to make peace and everything was fine, and Boris Johnson stepped in and said, "Oh no, don't do that."
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing that the conversations themselves were not at the point where the two sides were about to call it quits.
Okay. And one last pretty question that avoids, again, mainstream discourses, or was popular at one point but quickly seems to have faded away, which is the Nord Stream pipeline and what happened pretty much and what happened that. And I went because there's a lot of speculation. There was a report that came out from a famous reporter who did some won prizes previously for his reporting and exposés of different events dating back to the Vietnam War. But to get to the question, who would have the most to gain from destroying the Nord Stream pipeline, or what would be a motivating factor for destroying the Nord Stream pipeline with the
Uh,
evidence that has been
yeah,
presented?
it's a mystery. It's also somewhat unusual that we are, months after the event and we still have no idea what happened. Nor do we know if somebody knows what happened. There a bunch of different countries have attempted to do studies to figure out who did it, and I don't know if behind closed doors there has been an assessment with confidence of who carried it out. I did see the report by Seymour Hersh,
Mm-hmm.
the one you're referring to, that it was the U.S. that did it. I'm skeptical that the U.S. did it. This was a pipeline that the Germans had already shut down, and stopped work on it. Nord Stream 2 was not yet operational and hadn't opened. I don't. I would be very surprised if the U.S. carried out on the attack on the pipeline. I guess some folks think the most likely attacker was Russia, and that Russia did it to send a message to Europeans that their critical infrastructure was not safe. Well, would Russia want to blow up a pipeline that it had just spent years and billions of dollars building? I don't know. So, short answer to your question, Daniel, is it's a mystery, and we don't have a good answer to the puzzle.
Hmm. I take some insights that you saying kind of lean more towards, I guess, one conclusion. As you point out, why would Russia blow up a key asset of theirs? But even more so, independent investigations saw that there was no really true indicators of Russian involvement. And as you point to, and some reporting that I have heard is it is rather a mystery of who exactly did it, but I'm more inclined to believe if maybe the U.S. didn't do it, they would at least know who did it because of the amount of influence they have in this war. As you point to, nothing really have. Europe is highly dependent on the United States for security, and doing such flagrant act of aggression would be highly unlikely to be operated without the U.S.'s notice at the very least. Or
Could be. I mean, some people have
mhm.
speculated the Ukrainians did it.
And again, I think Ukraine would definitely be under the US's not maybe direction, but I would say most likely direction, personally speaking, but more so the US would know in the end. But I
You would
think
think so, but the
mhm,
Ukrainians have done things
that's
that, at
true.
least to the best of my knowledge, the U.S. has not been happy about,
Yeah, the
like
assassinations.
blowing up
Yeah,
a,
no, you're right.
a car in Moscow, hitting the Kerch Bridge, attacking bases in Russia. I don't know. I don't know that the Ukrainians cleared those with the U.S. first.
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
Well taken. But one, I guess, final question. I said two, but I do have one final one for you, which is hopefully more of a optimistic end to things that speak of war, which is what is a best possible case scenario, say 6 months to a year from now? What does the world look like over there in regards to war or peace? What do you think is, and practical too, a best possible case scenario?
Yeah. I mean, this is a war that will polarize the international system for quite some time.
Hmm.
We haven't talked about this yet, but one issue to keep an eye on is whether China steps in and starts to send arms to Russia. If Beijing does so, I think the relationship between the U.S. and China, which is already in bad shape, is going to get worse. So stay tuned on that front. But I guess the best case scenario would be Ukraine makes substantial battlefield gains in this fighting season. That is to say, spring until the weather gets cold again. I'm not very optimistic that Ukraine is going to win and expel Russian forces from its territory, but they may make significant gains. We then get to a point in which the US and its allies are able to broker an armistice, get the two sides to pull back from the front line, a demilitarized zone. And then over time, deal with the broader question of borders, of territorial disposition, and of the goal over the long run of getting all of Ukraine back into Ukrainian hands, but not by force, through diplomacy and discussion down the road. And Lord knows there's a lot of repair work to be done inside Ukraine, right? Billions, perhaps trillions of dollars in reconstruction. And there's going to be a lot of work required to rebuild some kind of normalized relationship with Russia and China, which in the big scheme of things is going to be important because of the need for great power cooperation in tackling some of the big issues of our time, which are not geopolitical rivalry, but climate change, nuclear proliferation, global health. These are issues that will require cooperation across ideological dividing lines.
Interesting. I think that calling for an armistice in the next, not calling for, but a best possible case scenario armistice is probably the best possible case scenario, a tentative armistice, and that moving forward, it'd be much more difficult to actually negotiate those borders, as you pointed out. But I want to thank you for your time, Charles. It was a pleasure speaking to you on these topics. I gained some good insight, fielded some great questions, and I think my audience would thank you as well.
Good to chat with you, Daniel. I enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise. Take care, and
Take
I'll see you
care.
guys.
Stay in touch.
We'll do.
Bye.